Welcome to my 8th video of the second chapter for our game design project, where we're making a action RPG in Unity. This one is all about the fireball. And so what we want to do is start setting up the fireball to have different effects for the different levels that we can charge to. Because we left off with the player being able to hold down the charge button to get different fireballs of different ranks to appear. And so first off, I did fix that issue that I was having at the end of the other video where I was getting some weird effects on that. And that's actually just because on the animations for these different fireballs, I actually had my delete on the travel animation rather than the animation delete on the impact. And so that's actually what had messed that up. So we're going to try to get some fireballs to do some cool stuff and then import some effects to do an explosion with. And yeah, so that's what we're going to do. So let's start with a few kind of maintenance-y things from the previous setups that we've done. So, and that's dealing a little bit with this charging animation. So as you can see, it does look a little weird that I'm moving and charging at the same time. So let's jump into the player code real fast and see what we can do to tweak that. Another issue is that my mana actually still is recharging while I am charging, and I didn't want that initially. So like if you notice, if I spend some mana and then as I'm still charging, it's recharging. But it stops when I'm attacking, but I don't want it to be recharging like that. So we want to fix that as well. The mana thing is pretty easy to fix. If we go down towards the bottom where we have our update cooldowns, because that's where we do mana regeneration. If we're not attacking, and let's also add, and we are not charging. So if we're not attacking or not charging an attack, mana can regenerate. If you wanted to also make it so that it doesn't regenerate until this cooldown ticker is up, we could add that too. And attack cooldown ticker is less than or equal to 0. So basically, your mana does not recharge if you're recovering from an attack as well. And you are free to tweak that as you want. Next up is making the player kind of move slower based on if they're charging or not. So let's expand on towards the end of the update method. So I'm going to close this update cooldowns. That's all I changed, was this one line. Towards the bottom of the update method, we slow the player if we're attacking. We can add another line for if we're charging. And we can adjust the move modifiers that way. So you can actually freeze the player while they're charging. I do feel like that's going to hurt the player significantly, gameplay-wise. And so what that's going to do is, while you're charging up, you can't move. So if I start charging, you can see that I'm not moving, which actually fits the animation a lot better. So that could be something to consider, that maybe we want to do that so this animation matches more to the gameplay. And you can also see now my mana stops while I'm charging something up, or if I'm attacking. So that is something to consider, or if you want to let the player have a slight bit of movement while they're charging, you could do that as well. So now when I'm charging, I can only move a little bit, but that, you know, still kind of looks a little bit weird. So for the sake of, you know, just doing stuff, I'll just freeze the player while they're charging as well. So that if you're attacking, you get stopped, and if you're charging, you get stopped. But you can play with those numbers to create something that you think might work out a little bit better. Like maybe I'll let the player move a little bit if they're attacking, but if they're charging, they're just completely stopped. You might have to play with the order of these if it's not doing what you want. Like you might have to move is charging in front in some cases, but I'm pretty happy with how it is now. So the next thing I want to do is consider updating where I'm actually spawning the fireball. And that's an interesting bug. That if I go up towards kind of like one of these walls here. Now normally my fireball's fine. Oops. But if I'm standing on this wall and I try to shoot a fireball, due to the size of the collider, it may just immediately impact right on top of me like that and not do it at once. And that actually has to do with the fact that the fireball is spawning from the center of the player. And the center of the player, as you can see from this gizmo, is higher actually than its collider. And that's because, you know, obviously your feet are what should be colliding with the environment, not your head. So that kind of brings us the question of, do we want to move the spawn location of the fireball down to the feet so that the fireball spawns more appropriately with where the player's actual hitbox is? So that can actually be pretty easily addressed in my ranged attack update. Ranged attack right here. Let's go down towards where we actually, the input button is released and we're spawning a fireball. And you can see that this instantiation line is kind of long. And if I wanted to add the ability for it to kind of spawn, I don't know if I did that in the last video, but if I wanted to add the ability for it to spawn a little bit below the player, let's find the offset of the collider, of the player's collider. And so we'll call this vector 2. Let's make it a vector 3. Well, we'll start with vector 2. We'll call it collider offset. And then we will add that in to my line right here where I'm spawning at transform.position, but then we're going to add in the collider offset. You can see that this causes an error. That's actually because this is being reported as a vector 3, and this is being reported as a vector 2. I think probably the easiest thing to do would just be to switch that to a vector 3 and problem solved. You can also cast this to being a vector 2. Like that. And casting to a vector 2 doesn't really cause any problems. As you can see, the error goes away. So both those solutions are acceptable for getting this to work. But now what that's going to do is spawn the fireball closer to my collider. And even if I wanted to, I could maybe even multiply this by like a scalar so that it's not as extreme. It kind of does the average of the center of the player and the offset of the player. So that's something to consider too. Maybe if you feel like spawning at your feet feels a little too gamey, you could try to multiply that by a slight offset, which will essentially average it, meaning it's 90% on the way towards your offset is how that would be. If you did 0.5, that means it'll spawn in the middle of where your center is and where the offset of your collider is. Alright, so that's one of the things that we can do to make the fireball spawning a little bit better and a little less buggy. Now the last thing is, let's say that you really want to just ditch this casting or the charging animation and you're not a huge fan of that. Well, if you take this out, if you disable that charging animation, and we go back in, you'll see that I get stuck in the attack and I can never attack again because it never releases me from the attack animation. And that's actually because the animator only will let me jump to the pointing forward casting animation out of the charge animation. So it could be worth considering adding another any state transition into cast where we allow the duration, fixed duration of 0 for the transition, and it can activate off of a cast trigger. So by adding that, if I did happen to take out this charge animation, it would let me immediately jump into that casting animation in case you want the player to be able to walk around while they're charging the fireball, and you just don't feel that that animation is appropriate for what you're trying to achieve. So I just add another exit out of any state, which does kind of make me, you know, I could get rid of that, but it's fine how it is. And so now I have that animation disabled, but I still can get my like pointing when I'm casting. And you know, for all intents and purposes, I'm still stopped while casting. So if you're going to do that, it would make sense to, you know, if my player is charging, you know, in a case like this, you'd want the move modifier to be like 0.5 so that the player can move. So you see I'm holding the mouse down right now, and I can still move and it looks natural, and then when I release, I get that little cast animation still. So that's up to you how you wish to kind of proceed on that, but I did want to give us the option of being able to still move while you're charging, and if you wanted to take out this animation, and I'll just put a comment there to mention that if I could take that out, and disabling that animation still lets the rest of this work. All right, so all of that seems pretty quality. And then that leads us to actually putting in the effects and stuff for the fireballs. But I think this would probably be a good stopping point for this video because you know, we just did a little bit of cleanup to some of the things that we had before, and then we're going to actually get to spawning these fireballs. I don't want to make this video too long because that next one might be like about 20 minutes. So we'll stop here. We're going to add the different layers of fireballs in the next video.